Television, newspapers, radio, the internet. Around the globe, media has become an ever-present part of everyday life.
I think the media constitute a very important force in society and therefore need to be scrutinized by people who know how they work.
Media plays a very critical role in that it can serve as an agent of change.
I think media has a bigger role to play in the society and the country as a whole, because people are being influenced by media, whether it be the new social media or your traditional print and radio and TV.
For many, the media has taken on a life of its own. Once held to be a mechanism of reflection of society, there is little doubt now that media defines society and influences how society defines the world.
Women can be seen in the media. They are seen, but they are not heard. That is the main problem. Women have to be given a voice.
That's why we have to think holistically, not only looking at the output of the media, but we have to look what happens before the media is produced.
You find this skinny, shapely woman dressed in this elegant clothing. That's fine to a certain extent. I'd also love to be beautiful and look like them. But then, that's where the problem lies. Once I see them, I want to look like them. At the back of my mind, I'm being brainwashed.
Over the last decade, gender and media activists have concerned themselves with a wide range of issues around media transformation as it relates to gender relations. Between 2009 and 2010, Gender Links produced 3 research pieces: Gender in Media Education, Glass Ceilings, and the Gender and Media Progress Study, which framed a discussion for gender, media, diversity, and change. These studies were brought together at the 4th Gender and Media Summit.
We've called our summit this year Taking Stock, Gender, Diversity, and the Media. And we're bringing together all this research that we've done over time, encapsulated, if you like, in the Progress Study.
The summit is very significant in that we get a chance to stop, to look at what we're doing and refocus as we move forward.
And we are asking ourselves some very hard questions about why it is taking so long for change to happen.
Participants at the 4th Gender and Media Summit applied themselves to the findings emerging from Gender Links research. It was found that while the proportion of female students attending media studies programs in the Southern African region vastly outstrip that of male students, these numbers are not represented in media houses or in senior management positions.
All students who come into our journalism program have to do the same core courses, but the difference comes in when they start to specialize. The male students would opt for audio production, they would opt for television production. The women students would choose media advertising strategies, they would choose public relations campaigns and special events. Now, there's nothing wrong with that, but at the end of the day, if they're going to look for a job that would get them into a position of seniority in a media house, they would need to have gone through the sort of legwork of doing the tough things in journalism.
The total number of employees in Southern African media houses constitute 41% women and 59% men. If South Africa is excluded from these findings, the percentage of women drops to 32%.
I've got a concern. When we started, when there was a presentation, we saw that women are going to journalism, studying journalism, but they are not seen in the newsrooms.
What happens to those women we train? So we're training these women to go into the media profession, but somewhere along the line they're going into other professions other than the media, which is what we train them for.
Because most of them, like when they finish in college, they tend to go into professions like public relations, advertising, and mostly it's because newsroom jobs mostly doesn't pay very well, and when they go to public relations, there are good opportunities, and also it's like the working hours. It's a bit easier when they are in the offices doing public relations. It's an 8 to 4 job rather than journalism at times it's 24 hours.
The Gender and Media Baseline Study was one of the most extensive gender and media monitoring projects ever done. researchers from 20 institutional partners analysed news footage from 12 Southern African countries over 1 month. This research piece was to become a benchmark in the gender and media space and laid the foundation for the Gender and Media Progress Study, which was profiled at the 4th Gender and Media Summit.
In 2003, when we did the baseline study, across the region, on average, women constituted 17% of news sources. So half the population, 17% of news sources. Now, 7 years later, after all this work and advocacy, policy, training, incredible amount of work, we find that we've just gone up 2% to 19%.
2 countries in the region, Lesotho and Seychelles, now have over 30% women sources in the news. Malawi and Tanzania showed significant improvement. Countries that pride themselves on having progressive media, such as South Africa, Botswana, Namibia and Mauritius, remained virtually static, while Mozambique moved backward from 15% women sources to 14%.
I was part again of a group of men that were being interviewed in some decision-making structure, and I was almost in the middle. But the microphones were moving from my left to the right, and I was just watching them as they moved from the left to the right and the left to the right. And I think 30 minutes later, after watching these microphones, nobody was directing any question to me, or the men next to me themselves were not allowing me to respond to any question. There was an understanding amongst the journalists, women and men, that these questions were meant for the men around me.
The findings of the Gender and Media Progress Study mirror the experiences of international organizations who face similar challenges.
There hasn't been as much progress, but it seems that 5 years ago, Africa was a little ahead of the global average.
The global media monitoring project took place at the same time as we were doing our regional study, and it found that across Africa, the average women's sources now is 19%. So Southern Africa is sitting with the Africa average, and that globally it's 24%.
The results of the Gender and Media Progress Study were surprising in some ways and bitterly disappointing in others.
As a journalist, the most shocking and horrible thing that I saw in that entire report, and I was a co-author, was single source stories. Something like 70% of all news stories monitored in Southern Africa were one single source. That's not journalism. I mean, that, as a journalist, it's a cardinal rule of journalism. You must present a balanced report.
Gender and media activists in the region have committed themselves to entrenching their gains and have recognized the need for long-term, sustained intervention.
We now have the SADC Protocol on Gender and Development that was adopted by our heads of state in 2008. And it sets some very specific targets for the attainment of gender equality, including in the media. I think we could frame our goals now in line with those provisions of the SADC protocol that we campaigned for. First and foremost is to mainstream gender into policies.
We believe that mainstreaming gender in media content has to be institutionalized, and the long-term solution is for media houses to have gender policies.
And one of the most exciting things to see at Capital FM in Malawi, that actually in 2003, when we did the Gender and Media Baseline Study, came out as one of the worst in terms of the performance of women as sources. Today, it's one of the best performers.
Capital FM, we are making tremendous progress, I could say. We have a gender policy which we launched on the 30th of August this year. And I think when we began implementing the policy, things are really changing. We are getting to see more and more voices of women being heard on the radio.
Policy remains an important priority for long-term sustained change in the gender and media arena. This has certainly been the case for Mauritius, one of the few countries where sustained policy intervention has seen improvements on the news floor and in news products.
The Mauritius Broadcasting Corporation is one of the first media houses that we worked with on developing a gender policy.
When we did this first research, the women's voices were at 14%. Now it's at 28%. This is a fantastic increase. And now whenever they have a program, whenever they have news coverage, they do it a point to seek diversity of voices.
I can tell you at NBC, we are doing everything we can to respect our gender policy, to implement the gender policy that we adopted in 2006.
Once media houses take ownership and embrace editorial and employment policies, then they begin to drive them within the media houses, and that actually can signal change. And we see it already with, again, the example of Base FM and Capital FM, where management actually has already put in place gender policies, and that's what's driving what we see in different types of coverage. These are two examples that actually show that gender is not an add-on, it is actually integral to all the news and issues that they cover.
Secondly, mainstreaming gender into training. That is provided for in the protocol. A number of these training institutions, universities for example, are funded by governments, so governments can assist.
The training institution has a very significant role to play in terms of the nature of our curricula. And I think the more we consult with government, with our development partners, it would inform the kind of curriculum that we're going to have.
Then there is the issue of women's representation within the media. The SADC protocol requires or urges, shall I say in the case of the media, because they're not government institutions, not all of them, that there be equal representation of women and men in all areas and at all levels of decision-making by 2015.
I believe that women have a more sensitive way of reporting on certain issues and a bit more able to feel certain emotions that are going through other people, and therefore it is important to have a good ratio of women and men in the media in order to have a balance.
As a Muslim woman, it's also been difficult in the sense that I'm a Muslim woman in the media, in mainstream media, and I've pushed boundaries in my own way, where people think that journalism's not the field for a Muslim woman. And it's okay to be standing behind the mic or sitting behind the mic and talking gender issues, because at the same time, nothing is taboo for me when I'm behind the mic.
The fourth area, very, very important, is around media content. How do we ensure that it's just a simple, basic thing? Women and men are given equal voice. We can't talk about citizenship, freedom of expression, as long as half the population is effectively silenced. And we need to begin to understand it that way.
I think the areas that need work are actually still around women's access to expression in and through the media, women as sources.
You know, women want to talk, it's just the media that is not accessing women's voices enough. I want to see more women in politics. I want to see more women in decision-making positions.
In the daily diaries presented every morning at your newspaper or your radio or wherever, the news desk, the news editor should interrogate each field report and say, that's a great story idea. What kind of sort of gender aspects are you going to explore? Or, you know, so you need to, training's great, but you also need to practice it in the newsroom, set a good example, get people to think critically.
People think that gender is just about women. It's not. They think it's just about adult women. It's not. It's about the girl child as well. Everything has a gender aspect or a gender element.
The fifth area that I would cite, again, very important, is the sensitivity around which we cover difficult issues. And that too is covered in the protocol. Gender violence, HIV and AIDS, issues of sexual orientation, unfortunately, are not specifically covered in that protocol because it's a regional instrument and there were compromises along the way.
It's when you start to get into the finer details around HIV and AIDS, who's being asked questions, around who's being asked certain questions about gender-based violence, these kind of things. You see we've made some progress where we're speaking to victims now as media instead of just speaking to people at the heads of tables at NGOs or people representing governments.
You have to give due attention to issues such as care work, HIV and AIDS, gender equality, and all this cannot be done in one day, but we should not be discouraged. We have to take the battle. The time is now.
During the Gender in Media Summit, a Ugandan newspaper ran a story calling for 100 of the country's alleged homosexuals to be killed. The story made front-page news, and the summit released a statement calling on media regulators to counter the impunity and detestable way in which minority groups are portrayed in media in Africa, with particular reference to gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender and intersex people. Sadly, this call came too late. David Kato, a gay rights activist who was one of the 100 who were targeted by the newspaper, was brutally murdered in early 2011.
From the Coalition of African Lesbians and for myself personally, that it has been quite an enriching space to be. This is the first time that we have been welcomed into a space of the Gender and Media Summit. And I must say that I think I find it a revolutionary space. I think it's the first time that we are with so many journalists and we're not fighting.
I think in all of this, probably the most important component is the citizen, to create a critical citizenry that actually is able to hold the media accountable with a level of authority, who has the knowledge to say what you're giving us is not good enough and we would like better, and have then the mechanisms with which to take up complaints and that are effectively dealt with when they're not receiving what it is they deserve.
The Gender and Media Summit has become an important opportunity for gender activists to reflect, share, and in some cases celebrate significant victories in the quest for gender equality and justice in the media.
The summit, for me, brought together a very serious group of people, a group of people who are committed to taking things forward and have articulated such. I think we moved a bit from the sort of activism and advocacy to a very serious implementation stage.
I believe life is the art of the possible. And when I see changes in one media house, even if there hasn't been a huge big change in the island of Mauritius or in the whole of Southern Africa, it tells me change is possible.
And change, there must be change we can believe in. It will not be only on my ability to bring change, but I'm asking every people to believe in your ability to bring change, and that we are connected as one people together.
I couldn't help but think of how wonderful it is when the men, like the women, become excited about what they had been exposed to.
The issue of gender in the media was not an issue, it was not known. Until someone comes and pinpoints certain things, we are not aware what you are not doing right.
The men I spoke to couldn't believe what they had experienced here. And I think that's exactly what we want to have happening, that both women and men in our media houses are needed to get things right.
In our session on community and social media, we were talking about the I stories and the power of a personal testimony or the power of one person's story. And I believe that it was Tanya Farber who actually said, well, if you get enough I stories together, you wind up with a we story.
So being in a group of people like this, where you see the phenomenal work that is being done all over the region, and then in countries like India, when Amu spoke about the book that they had done, that is so inspiring. It gives you a sense that this is a struggle worth fighting. This is a struggle where triumphs are happening, and that, truly speaking, ultimately there's a community of us across Southern Africa, across Africa and the globe, that are working towards gender equality.
Every day, everywhere, the march towards gender equality continues, and we will not stop until we reach that goal.
I see people who've been with us through all 4 summits who are back here, but every time I see new people coming, and I see young people coming, and those young people, I think it's a brilliant time to work with them and catch them. I mean, they articulate these issues now a lot better than I do. When I feel like I'm handing on the baton, then I feel as though, there is definitely hope for the future.